You think you know what real thirst is. You don't. Thirst isn't just a dry mouth. It's a thief. It steals your thoughts, your memories, until all you are is a hollow thing stumbling toward a shimmering lie on the horizon. For 2 days, the desert had been stealing from me. My strength, my hope, and it was starting to steal my daughter, Ruth. Her small hand in mine was getting lighter. Her bonnet, too big for her head, shadowed cheeks that were already turning to bone. Every few steps, she'd stumble. Every time I'd pull her back up, my own muscles screaming, I'd whisper promises into her ear. Just a little farther. There's water soon. Lies. Every single one of them. But a mother's lies are the foundations of a child's hope. And hope was the only thing we had left. The town had spit us out, laughed us out. The sheriff, with his polished boots and polished cruelty, told us to move along. No place for strays, he'd said, his eyes never once looking at the starving child beside me. So we walked, and now the only company we had were the buzzards circling overhead. Patient, so horribly patient. Ruth saw them, of course. She asked if they were watching us. I told her no. Another lie. Heavier this time, because I knew they were. They were waiting for us to become a meal. They were waiting for me to fail. And as the sun began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in colors too beautiful for such a cruel world, I finally fell. My knees hit the baked earth, hard. I didn't have the strength to get up. I pulled Ruth into my lap, holding her tight, and I leaned my back against a dead-looking mesquite tree. This was it. This was the end. The buzzards circled lower. I closed my eyes, and that's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this empty world. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, not chasing, not fleeing, just coming. I opened my eyes and my heart hammered against my ribs. A silhouette was forming in the shimmering heat. A lone rider. In the desert, a stranger is one of two things: salvation or a faster death. I held my daughter tighter, my body tensing for a fight I couldn't possibly win. I didn't know it then, but he was neither salvation nor death. He was something far, far more complicated, and he was about to drag us into a hell even hotter than the one we were already in. The rider didn't hurry. That's what scared me the most. He moved like a man who owned the silence, who had a partnership with the heat and the dust. As he got closer, his shape became clearer. Broad shoulders, a hat pulled low, shadowing his face completely. He rode a big bay horse that moved with a calm that felt unnatural out here. He stopped a dozen paces from our pathetic scrap of shade under the mesquite. He just sat there, in the saddle, looking down at us. Not with pity, not with anything I could name. It was like he was measuring us, sizing us up. Finally, he swung down from the horse, his boots crunching on the gravel. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. He was tall, taller than I'd realized. He walked toward us, each step deliberate, and I could feel a scream building in my throat. I was too weak to run, too tired to fight. All I could do was make myself a shield for my daughter. He stopped right in front of me and crouched down. I still couldn't see his face, just the dark shadow under his hat brim. He reached for the canteen on his belt. My whole body flinched, but he just held it out. His voice was low, like rocks grinding together. Water! I stared at the canteen. My pride, the stupid, stubborn thing that had gotten us this far, screamed at me not to take it, not to beg. But then Ruth, my tiny, fading Ruth, reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers barely brushed the metal. That broke me. I snatched the canteen and held it to her lips. She drank like a wild thing, water spilling down her chin. When she finally slumped back against me, her thirst satisfied for a moment, I let myself have a single desperate swallow. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted. The man just watched. He didn't say a word. When I was done, he didn't take the canteen back. He just stood up, but his eyes weren't on me anymore. They were on Ruth. Specifically, they were on the small, tarnished silver locket hanging around her neck. It was a cheap thing, the only gift her father, Silas, had ever given her. A worthless piece of tin. The stranger's gaze was locked on it. It was an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the look of a hunter who has finally found his prey. He hadn't stopped for a woman and a child dying in the desert. He had stopped for the locket, and that's when I realized this wasn't a rescue, it was an ambush. My mind raced. What was this? Who was this man? Why did he care about a worthless piece of silver? He gestured with his head toward the horse. There's a place, a mile from here. Food, shade. His offer hung in the air, heavy with unspoken things. My first instinct was to say no, to tell him we were fine, to crawl away into the dust and die with what little pride I had left. But I looked down at Ruth. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady now, thanks to his water. Pride wouldn't feed her. Pride wouldn't keep her alive through the night. I gave a single sharp nod. I couldn't trust my voice. He didn't offer me the saddle. Instead, he lifted Ruth from my arms. He did it with a strange gentleness, almost a reverence, holding her like she was made of spun glass. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, then extended a hand down to me. I took it. His grip was like iron. He pulled me up behind him, seating me on the back of the horse. I sat stiffly, my hands gripping the back of his saddle, trying not to lean against him. The warmth of his back was a strange comfort and a terrifying threat all at once. We rode in silence as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the desert into a world of long, distorted shadows. The place he took us wasn't a town. It wasn't even a real ranch. It was a small, lonely cabin made of sun-bleached wood, almost invisible against the graying landscape. A single barn stood beside it like a silent guardian. It felt temporary, a place to hide, not a place to live. He helped me down, then gently handed me Ruth, who was still asleep. He led us inside. It was one room, spare and clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a bed in the corner. He laid a blanket on the floor for us. Then he gave us bread and dried meat from his saddlebags. We ate in silence. He sat at the table, cleaning a long-barreled rifle, the metallic clicks echoing in the small space. He never took his hat off. I couldn't stop watching him, trying to piece it all together. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight. I had to break it. "Why are you helping us?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't look up from his rifle. The lamplight glinted off the steel. "I'm not." My blood ran cold. "What?" He finally stopped his work and looked at me. For the first time, the lamp cast enough light for me to see his eyes under the brim. They were pale like a winter sky, and they held no warmth at all. "I'm not helping you," he repeated, his voice flat. "I'm using you, or more specifically, I'm using what your daughter is wearing." He nodded toward the locket. "Where did you get it?" I clutched Ruth closer. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. It was a gift from her father. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, more intense. Her father. And what was his name? I hesitated. I had learned the hard way that a man's name could be a dangerous thing. "Why do you want to know?" He smiled then, but it was a cold, sharp thing. It didn't touch his eyes. "Because I have a feeling his name is Silas, and Silas owes me something. He owes me a map, and I'm willing to bet my life that map is inside that cheap little locket." My world tilted. The desert hadn't been the thing that was going to kill us. The town hadn't been the real threat. It was Silas. It had always been Silas. And this man, this stranger, he wasn't a rescuer. He was a collector, here to claim a debt written in blood. I stared at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Silas. He knew his name. My Silas, who had promised me a home, a future, and then vanished like smoke on the wind. He had been a man of easy smiles and whispered promises, but he'd had a shadow in his eyes I'd always chosen to ignore. A darkness I'd pretended was just a part of his charm. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. The words tasted like ash. The stranger, who I now knew was named Edward, just leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. He wasn't angry. He was patient. That was so much worse. "Don't lie to me, Nora," he said, and the sound of my own name on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. "I know who you are. I know you were with him in Crimson Gulch before he ran. And I know he left you with the only thing he couldn't carry, his daughter, and his key. He tapped the table with a single calloused finger. The locket. It's just a picture, I insisted, my voice trembling. A picture of me. Is it? He asked, his voice soft, dangerous. Open it. Show me. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much. And a part of me, a deep, terrified part, didn't want to know. What if he was right? What if this whole time I'd been carrying the proof of Silas's true nature around my daughter's neck? Edward sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. Look, I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt the girl. But the men Silas stole from, they're not like me. They won't ask nicely. My breath caught. What men? The Black Creek Gang, he said. The same men who probably run that town that threw you out. They're not laughing at a poor stray, Nora. They're looking for you. They're looking for that locket. Silas stole their entire payroll from the Union Pacific, a fortune in gold, and he hid it somewhere only he could find. The map is the key. It all crashed down on me at once. The smirking men in the saloon, the sheriff's cold eyes telling us to move on. They weren't just cruel. They were scared, or they were hunting. They hadn't been pushing us out into the desert to die. They'd been trying to get their hands on us, on Ruth. The cabin, which had felt like a shelter moments ago, now felt like a trap. The single window was a dark, accusing eye staring out into the night. Who are you? I whispered. Are you one of them? He shook his head. He pulled back the lapel of his dusty coat. Pinned to the inside was a small tin star, a U.S. Marshal. My name is Edward Stone, he said, and I've been hunting Silas Blackwood for 6 months, ever since he and his gang robbed that train and killed my partner. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. He wasn't just a lawman. This was personal. Vengeance. And we were caught right in the middle of it. Ruth stirred in her sleep, her small hand clutching at the locket. My protector, my daughter, my curse. I was living in a cage built by a ghost, and now the keepers had arrived. The next morning, Edward was all business. He told me to stay inside, to keep the doors barred. He spent the day fortifying the small cabin, boarding up the back window, checking his ammunition. The air was thick with a tension you could almost taste. He was expecting them. He was preparing for a war. I watched him through the small crack in the door. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his face set like stone. This wasn't the quiet stranger from the desert anymore. This was a man preparing to kill or be killed. My fear was a living thing, coiling in my gut. What was I supposed to do? Trust this man, this marshal whose quest for revenge had entangled us? Or run back out into the desert, toward the very men he said were hunting us? There was no good choice. There was only waiting. The day bled into evening. The sky turned a bruised purple. Edward came inside, his face grim. They'll come after dusk, he said. They'll have seen the smoke from the chimney. He handed me a pistol. It was heavy, cold, foreign in my hands. Do you know how to use this? I shook my head, my eyes wide. Point it at whatever isn't me, he said, his voice flat, and pull the trigger until it's empty. He looked over at Ruth, who was playing quietly on the floor with some twigs. A flicker of something crossed his face. Regret? Pity? I couldn't tell. Keep her away from the door, he said, his voice softer now. No matter what you hear. You understand? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The sun vanished. The world outside went completely black. The only sounds were the crickets and the frantic beating of my own heart. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world, waiting for the end. And then, a new sound. The distant, unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. They were here. Edward blew out the lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. He took his position by the door, rifle raised. He was completely still, a statue carved from shadow and resolve. I huddled in the corner with Ruth, the heavy pistol in my lap, my arms wrapped around my daughter. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion. I put a finger to my lips, praying she would stay silent. A voice called out from the darkness, a gravelly, mocking voice. Silas, we know you're in there, or at least your woman is. Send her out, and we'll make this easy. Edward didn't answer. He didn't even breathe. Another voice, younger, more eager. "We saw the marshal's horse, Jeb. He's in there with her." The first voice, Jeb, laughed. A horrible grating sound. "Even better. Two birds, one stone. Come on out, lawman. Don't make us burn the girl." My blood turned to ice. They knew. They knew everything. This wasn't a guess. They had been watching us. Waiting. Edward's voice was a low growl beside me. "Stay down." And then the world exploded in a shower of glass and splintered wood as the first bullet tore through the window. The gunshot was deafening in the tiny cabin. Ruth screamed, a high, terrified sound that ripped through me. I pulled her down flat against the floor, covering her body with my own, the heavy pistol digging into my stomach. Splinters of wood rained down on us. Another shot and another. They were shooting blind, trying to flush us out. Edward didn't waste a bullet. He was a patient predator. He waited, his rifle pressed to his shoulder, aimed at the shattered window. I could hear them outside, shouting, their boots crunching as they circled the cabin. They were testing the defenses, looking for a weak spot. "He ain't shooting back," one of them yelled. "Maybe we got him." "Or maybe he's smarter than you damn fool," Jeb's voice growled back. "Get the lamp oil. We'll smoke 'em out." Panic seized me. Fire. They were going to burn us alive. I looked at Edward, a dark shape against the paler darkness of the window. He was perfectly calm. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. He was waiting for one of them to make a mistake, one of them to get too close. I heard a scuttling sound near the wall, then the glug-glug of liquid splashing against the dry wood. They were soaking the cabin in oil. My breath hitched. We had moments. Just moments. Suddenly, a dark shape filled the window frame. A man silhouetted against the moonlight, holding a lit torch. For a single frozen second, he was perfectly still. That's the mistake Edward had been waiting for. The report from his rifle was a physical blow, a concussive force that shook the entire room. The man in the window jerked backward and vanished with a choked cry. The torch fell to the ground, sputtering in the dirt. Outside, all hell broke loose. The gang opened fire, a relentless barrage of lead that ripped through the thin wooden walls. Bullets whizzed through the cabin, thudding into the opposite wall, shattering the few meager possessions Edward had. It was a miracle we weren't hit. I pressed myself and Ruth as flat as we could get, my heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Edward was moving. He crawled away from the window, keeping low. "They know where I am now," he whispered, his voice tight. "They'll try the door." As if on cue, a heavy thud slammed against the door, making the whole frame shudder. They were using a log as a battering ram. Thud. The wood groaned. Thud. A crack appeared. Thud. The heavy bar Edward had placed across it began to splinter. Ruth was crying, her small sobs muffled against my chest. I had to do something. I couldn't just lie here and wait for them to break in and kill us all. I looked at the pistol in my hand, pointed at whatever isn't me. I crawled toward the fireplace, my knuckles scraping on the rough floorboards. The fireplace was made of stone. It was the only solid thing in the whole cabin. If I could get behind it, another massive crash. The bar broke, and the door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then two figures charged in, dark shapes against the moonlit yard, guns blazing. Edward, hidden in the shadows to the side of the door, fired twice. Two quick, brutal explosions of light and sound. The men fell, one collapsing in the doorway, the other stumbling forward into the room. But there were more behind them. I could see them massing in the yard. We were trapped, outnumbered. The man who had stumbled into the room was still moving. He was trying to push himself up, his pistol still in his hand. He was between us and Edward. Edward was reloading, his movements frantic in the dark. He wouldn't be ready in time. The man on the floor was raising his gun. He was aiming it at Edward's back. I didn't think. I didn't aim. I scrambled out from behind the fireplace, raised the heavy pistol with both hands, pointed it at the dark shape on the floor, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in my hand, the noise a physical shock. The man on the floor grunted and went still. I had done it. I had shot a man. Bile rose in my throat. I stared at my hands, at the smoking pistol, horrified at what I had become. Edward finished reloading. He glanced over at me, his face unreadable in the gloom. "Stay down," was all he said, before turning his attention back to the open doorway. But the gang wasn't charging anymore. A voice, Jeb's voice, called out from the darkness. "All right, Marshall, you win this round, but we ain't going nowhere. You got a woman and a kid in there. You can't stay awake forever, and we got all the time in the world." They were settling in for a siege, and we were running out of everything. Water, ammunition, time. The night wore on, a long, agonizing crawl toward a dawn I wasn't sure we'd see. The gang kept their distance, occasionally firing a shot into the walls to keep us on edge. Edward stayed by the door, a tireless sentinel. I stayed with Ruth, who had cried herself to sleep in the corner. Sometime in the darkest hour just before morning, Edward crawled over to me. "We need to talk about the locket," he whispered, his voice urgent. I was exhausted, my nerves shredded. "What about it? It's not a map. It's a picture, I told you." "Silas wasn't a sentimental man," he insisted. "He wouldn't have left you something useless. There's something more to it. Think, Nora. Did he ever tell you anything? A phrase, a riddle? Anything?" I racked my brain, trying to push past the fog of fear and exhaustion. I tried to remember Silas, his easy laugh, the way he'd brush the hair from my face. It all seemed like a dream from another life. And then a memory surfaced, faint, unimportant at the time. We were sitting by a river, and he was holding the locket, turning it over and over in his hands. He'd smiled that secret smile of his. "The prettiest things hide the sharpest secrets," he'd said. "You just have to know how to look." He said, you just have to know how to look," I whispered to Edward. Edward's eyes lit up with a sudden intensity. "Let me see it." My hand went instinctively to Ruth's neck. The locket was warm from her skin. It felt wrong to take it, to betray this last gift from her father, even a father who was a monster. But we had no other choice. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. I pulled it off and handed it to Edward. He took it over to the faint moonlight filtering through the doorway. He didn't try to pry it open. He held it in his palm, his thumb running along the cheap, ornate scrollwork on the casing. He twisted it. Nothing. He pushed on a small flower embossed in the corner. A tiny, almost inaudible click echoed in the silence. The back of the locket popped open. It wasn't a space for a picture. It was a hollow compartment, and inside, folded into a minuscule square, was a tiny yellowed piece of paper. Edward carefully unfolded it. It wasn't paper. It was vellum, and drawn on it, in faded black ink, was a map. My heart stopped. He was right. He had been right all along. But as Edward stared down at the map, a strange expression crossed his face. It wasn't triumph. It was confusion. Then his eyes widened in what looked like horror. "What is it?" I breathed. He looked up at me, his face pale in the moonlight. "This isn't a map to gold," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "I know these symbols. I've seen them in territorial reports." He handed the map to me. It was a crude drawing of a series of canyons and a single marked cave. But inside the drawing of the cave were other symbols. A skull, crossbones, and a word, written in shaky letters. Quarantine. "This isn't a treasure map," Edward said, his voice grim. "This is a map to a mass grave, a Spanish flu pit from the war. Silas didn't lead his men to a fortune." He paused, and the full, horrifying truth of it landed on us both. He led them to their deaths, and he was going to leave them there to rot. The implication of it was staggering. Silas wasn't just a thief, he was a mass murderer. He'd planned to lead his entire gang to this contaminated place, let them get sick and die, and keep the gold all for himself. The men outside weren't just hunting for a map to their payday. They were hunting for a map to their own graves, and they didn't even know it. "We have to tell them," I said, the words tumbling out. "If they know..." "Know what?" Edward cut me off, his voice hard as iron. "That their leader is a monster who planned to kill them? They won't believe us. They'll think it's a trick, a lie to save our own skins. It won't stop them. It'll just make them angrier." He was right. These were desperate men. Hope, even false hope, was a powerful drug. The truth wouldn't set them free. It would get us killed faster. He refolded the map and tucked it into his shirt pocket. This changes nothing for us right now. We still have to get through the morning. But it changed everything for me. The last lingering shred of the man I thought I loved died in that moment. Silas wasn't a charming rogue who'd made bad choices. He was poison, a sickness far worse than the one marked on that map. And he had left that sickness hanging around my daughter's neck. A cold fury began to burn in my chest, a clean, hard anger that pushed the fear aside. I had been a victim for too long, a victim of Silas's lies, of the town's cruelty, of this pointless, bloody siege. No more. "What's the plan?" I asked Edward, and my voice was different, stronger. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his pale eyes. He saw the change too. "At dawn, their eyes will be adjusting to the light. They'll be tired. It's our only chance to make a break for it. The horses are in the barn. If we can get to them—" "They'll be watching the barn," I said. "Of course they will be." "I know," he said, "which is why you're going to be the diversion." My newfound resolve wavered. "What?" "They want the woman and the kid," he said, his voice clinical, detached. "When the sun comes up, you're going to walk out the front door. With Ruth, you're going to hold your hands up. You're going to tell them you're giving up, that you'll trade the map for safe passage." "They'll kill me," I whispered. "They won't," he said, with a certainty that didn't comfort me at all. "They won't risk damaging the map. They'll be focused on you, all of them. And while they're focused on you, I'll slip out the back, get the horses, and come around. You just need to buy me a few minutes." It was a crazy plan, a suicidal plan. He was asking me to walk out into a nest of killers, using my daughter as a shield, on the slim hope that he could circle back before they decided to just shoot me and take the locket. But what other choice did we have? Stay here and be burned alive, starve to death? I looked at Ruth, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the fact that her whole world was a lie built on greed and death. I would do anything to get her out of this. Anything. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "I'll do it." We spent the last hour of darkness in silence. Edward gave me his last few swallows of water. He checked my pistol, making sure it was loaded. "Don't use it unless you have to," he warned. "Just be the frightened woman. It's what they'll be expecting." As the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he put a hand on my shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. "Nora, you can do this." I looked into his eyes, really looked, for the first time. The coldness was still there, the hardness of a man shaped by violence. But underneath it, there was something else, a flicker of respect. He wasn't just using me anymore. He was counting on me. I woke Ruth gently. I explained to her that we were going to play a game, a quiet game. She was sleepy and confused, but she nodded, trusting me completely. That trust was a knife in my heart. The sky outside was turning from gray to pink. It was time. Edward moved to the back of the cabin, where he'd loosened some of the boards. He gave me one last nod. I took a deep breath, lifted Ruth onto my hip, and walked to the shattered doorway. My heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I could see them out there, scattered figures, taking cover behind rocks and dead trees. Their faces were grim, bearded, tired from a long night. I held my free hand up high. "Don't shoot!" I yelled, my voice shaking. "We're coming out. I'll give you what you want." Every rifle turned toward me. I was the center of their world. A dozen guns all pointed at me and my child. Jeb, the leader, stepped out from behind a large boulder, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was a big man with a cruel, scarred face. A predatory smile spread across his lips. "Well, look what we have here. The marshals finally run out of nerve. Smart choice, girl. Now bring that map on over here. Slow and easy." I took my first step out of the cabin, then another. The ground was littered with spent shell casings. The morning air was cold, crisp, smelling of gunpowder and pine. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide. But I kept walking, one step at a time, directly toward a man who would surely kill me. I could feel Edward's escape behind me, a silent prayer that he was moving fast, that he was getting to the barn. I just had to keep them talking, keep them looking at me. The marshal is dead, I lied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. You shot him last night. It's just me and my daughter now. Jeb's smile widened. Is that so? We'll check on that later. First, the locket. I was halfway across the yard now. My mind was screaming. Where is he? Where is Edward? You have to promise to let us go, I said, trying to stall. Promise you won't hurt us. Jeb laughed, that same horrible grating sound from the night before. Oh, I promise you won't feel a thing. He started walking toward me, his hand outstretched. This was it. It was over. The plan had failed. Edward wasn't coming. And then I heard it. A sound that cut through the morning tension. A loud, sharp whinny from the far side of the barn. It was the sound of a horse in distress. Every head, including Jeb's, whipped around toward the sound. In that split second of distraction, I knew this was my only chance. It wasn't Edward coming to the rescue. It was just a random sound. But it was enough. I wasn't a frightened woman anymore. I dropped to one knee, pushing Ruth behind me. I raised the pistol, the one Edward had told me not to use, and I fired. I didn't aim for Jeb. I aimed for the dirt right in front of him. The shot kicked up a cloud of dust. The surprise was total. For a second, no one moved. They were all staring at me, the helpless woman who was suddenly fighting back. And in that second, the barn door exploded outward. Edward burst out, not on one horse but leading two. He was already in the saddle, firing his rifle from the hip. The gang, caught between me in the front and Edward in the back, was thrown into chaos. It wasn't a rescue. It was a crossfire, and we were the bait. Chaos erupted. The gang, caught completely off guard, scrambled for cover. Edward charged forward, his horse a powerful, driving force, his rifle barking flame, and death. He wasn't aiming to kill, I realized. He was shooting low, at their legs, at the rocks around them, creating panic and confusion. He was hurting them. Jeb screamed orders, trying to rally his men, but it was too late. Their siege mentality had been shattered. They were exposed, disorganized. Edward galloped past them, straight toward me. He reined his horse in so hard it reared up, its hooves slashing the air. The second horse was right behind him. Nora! Now! He yelled. I didn't hesitate. I scooped Ruth up, my heart hammering, and ran toward him. He leaned down, his arm outstretched. I grabbed his hand, and with a strength that seemed impossible, he hauled both me and Ruth up onto the second horse. He slapped its rump, hard. Go, ride east, don't stop. The horse bolted, nearly throwing me off. I grabbed a handful of mane, clinging on for dear life. My arms wrapped tightly around Ruth. I didn't look back. I just rode. The sound of gunfire faded behind us as we galloped into the rising sun, leaving the cabin, the siege, and that part of my life behind, in the dust. We rode for what felt like hours, pushing the horses, putting as much distance as we could between us and the gang. Finally, as the sun climbed high in the sky, Edward signaled for us to stop in a small, hidden ravine. The horses were lathered in sweat, their sides heaving. I slid off, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I set Ruth down, and she immediately clung to my skirt, her face pale with shock. Edward dismounted, his face a grim mask of exhaustion and adrenaline. Are you all right? He asked. I nodded, unable to speak. I had walked out there to die. I had fired a gun at a man. I had ridden through a gunfight. I wasn't the same woman who had stumbled out of the desert 2 days ago. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. That sound, I said, my voice hoarse. The horse in the barn. Was that part of the plan? Edward shook his head. No, that was luck. One of their horses must have gotten loose and spooked mine. He looked at me, his gaze intense. But you didn't wait for the plan. You made your own. You saved us back there, Nora. His words sent a strange warmth through me. It wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact, acknowledgement. He saw me not as a burden, not as a victim, but as an equal. He pulled the map from his pocket and stared at it. They'll be after us, he said. They'll be angry now, and they still think this leads to gold. They won't give up. So what do we do? I asked. We use it against them, he said, a cold, dangerous light in his eyes. We lead them right where Silas wanted them to go. We lead them to the grave. The plan was even more reckless than the last one. We would ride toward the location on the map, the quarantine cave. We'd leave a clear trail for the gang to follow. Once they were close, Edward would double back and pick them off one by one in the narrow rocky canyons, using the terrain to his advantage. It was a guerrilla war fought by a lawman who was starting to operate far outside the law. "And what about us?" I asked, holding Ruth closer. "You and the girl will be the bait," he said. "You'll ride ahead to the cave. Make camp. Make it look like you're waiting for them. They'll be so focused on getting the map from you, they'll walk right into the trap." My blood ran cold. "You want me to lead my daughter to a place filled with disease?" "The entrance is safe," he said quickly. "The reports said the sickness was deep in the caves, where the air is still. We won't go inside." "It's the only way, Nora. They have to believe you have the real map. They have to believe you're cornered." I looked at my daughter. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the ugly world I was being forced to navigate. Edward was asking me to risk everything, again, but he was also offering the only thing I truly wanted, an end to this, a final, definitive end. I thought of Silas, of his casual cruelty. I thought of Jeb and his men, who would have burned us alive without a second thought. My fury returned, cold and sharp. "All right," I said, "but when this is over, you and I are taking that map, and we're burning it. No one else ever needs to know about this place." A flicker of a smile touched Edward's lips. "It's a deal." The next day was a blur of hard riding and constant fear. We knew they were behind us. We could almost feel their hatred pushing us forward. As we entered the labyrinth of canyons marked on the map, the landscape became oppressive, the rock walls closing in, blocking out the sun. It felt like we were riding into the jaws of the earth. We found the cave easily. It was a dark, gaping maw in the side of a cliff, a place that radiated a profound sense of wrongness. A few withered, dead trees stood near the entrance like skeletal sentinels. The air was unnaturally still. We made a small, smokeless fire, just as Edward had instructed. I sat with Ruth, trying to read a story from a tattered book Edward had in his saddlebags, but the words were meaningless. My ears were strained, listening for any sound. Edward had left hours ago, circling back into the canyons like a wolf. Was he alive? Was his plan working? Or were we sitting here, waiting for our own execution? As dusk began to settle, a sound echoed through the canyon, a single gunshot. My heart leaped into my throat. Then another. Silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then two more shots, closer this time. A man's scream cut short. I grabbed Ruth and pulled her deeper into the shadows of the cave entrance, my hand hovering over the pistol tucked into my waistband. More silence. My mind was a canvas for horrible images. Edward, lying dead in a canyon. Jeb and his men, descending on us with victorious smiles. The waiting was a special kind of torture. Finally I saw him, a single figure, walking out of the twilight. It was Edward. He was limping, and his left arm was stained dark with blood. But he was alive, and he was alone. He collapsed against the rock wall next to me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's done," he said, his voice strained. It's over." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. We had survived. We were safe. He'd done it. He'd saved us. He slid down the wall, wincing in pain. I rushed to his side, tearing a strip of cloth from my skirt to bandage his arm. As I wrapped the wound, my fingers brushed against his shirt pocket. I felt the crinkle of the vellum map inside, and then I felt something else, something hard and flat underneath it. My brow furrowed. I reached into his pocket. I pulled out the map, and behind it, I pulled out a second piece of vellum. It was another map. This one was newer, the ink sharper. It showed the same canyons, the same cave, but it marked a different location, a hidden passage deep inside, and at the end of that passage, a single word was written. Gold. My entire body went rigid. I looked from the new map to the old one, the quarantine map. Then I looked at Edward. His face was pale, his eyes closed in pain. But as I watched, a slow, cold smile spread across his lips. "You are a clever woman, Nora," he whispered without opening his eyes. "Took you longer than I expected, though." The world stopped. The relief, the gratitude, it all curdled into ice in my veins. He wasn't a marshal. The Tin Star was a lie. He hadn't been hunting Silas for revenge. He was just another thief. He had used the gang to clear the way, used the quarantine story to manipulate me, used us as bait to get what he really wanted. He wasn't Silas's enemy. He was his partner. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Every act of kindness, every moment of perceived camaraderie, it was all a lie. The rescue in the desert, the stand at the cabin, his talk of justice. It was all part of an elaborate, cruel theater designed to get him this map. He wasn't saving us. He was just a more patient kind of predator. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would tear me apart. He opened his eyes. The pain was still there, but it was overshadowed by a chilling, triumphant amusement. "Does it matter? I'm the man with the gold. Or I will be, thanks to you." He tried to push himself up, wincing as his wounded arm protested. "Silas was my partner, yes, but he got greedy, decided to cut me out. He created that fake quarantine map to lead the rest of the gang to their deaths, and he was going to disappear with the real one. He just made one mistake." "What mistake?" I spat, the word full of venom. "He told me about you," Edward said, his eyes glinting. "He told me if anything ever happened to him, the key was with his girl. He never trusted banks. He trusted sentiment. He figured no one would ever suspect a child's cheap locket. It was his insurance policy." My mind reeled. So Silas hadn't abandoned us out of cowardice. He'd stashed us like a lockbox, a piece of property to be claimed later. We weren't his family. We were his failsafe. Edward finally managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily against the rock wall. "Now, I'll be taking both maps. And the horses. You and the girl. Well, I'd stay out of the cave if I were you." He held out his hand, palm up. The arrogance, the casual dismissal of our lives after everything we'd been through. It broke something inside me. The fear was gone. The shock was gone. All that was left was a diamond-hard point of fury. I looked at the two maps in my hand. I looked at Ruth, huddled by the dead fire, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. And I looked at this man, this monster who was no different from Silas. I made a decision. I handed him the quarantine map, the fake one. He snatched it, his eyes hungry. He didn't even look at it, so sure of his victory. He tucked it into his pocket. "The other one, Nora." I held the real map tightly in my fist. "No." His smile vanished. "Don't be stupid. I killed 5 men to get here. Don't make me kill a woman and a child." "You won't," I said, and my voice was calm. Frighteningly calm. "Because you're hurt, you're weak, and you have no idea which one of these canyons leads out of here. But I do." I was paying attention. His eyes narrowed. He took a step toward me, but his injured leg buckled slightly. He was bluffing. He was wounded, exhausted, and in a maze of rock without a guide. I was the one holding all the cards. "Give me one of the horses," I said, my voice like steel, "and a day's worth of water. You can keep the other. By the time you're strong enough to ride, I'll be long gone, and you can try your luck finding your precious gold or finding your way out." It was the biggest gamble of my life. I was betting everything on his greed, betting that the promise of gold would outweigh his desire for immediate, bloody revenge. He stared at me, his face a storm of fury and calculation. I could see the war in his eyes. He could kill me now, but he'd be trapped here, wounded, with no guarantee of finding the treasure or escaping. Or he could let me go, heal, and then have it all. The silence stretched, thin and taut. He was weighing a woman's life against a fortune. Finally, a slow, ugly smile spread across his face again. "All right, Nora, you win, for now." He gestured to the horses. "Take your pick, but know this. The desert is a big place, but it ain't that big. I will find you, and when I do, I'm getting my map back." I didn't say another word. I grabbed the reins of the healthier-looking horse, filled a single canteen from his supply, and lifted Ruth into the saddle. I climbed up behind her and looked down at him one last time. He was watching me, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifyingly pure. I turned the horse and rode away, not looking back. I didn't ride east, back toward civilization. I rode west, deeper into the unknown, following the twisted paths of the canyons. I had the real map, a map to a fortune I never wanted, but it was also a map that could get me killed. I rode until the moon was high in the sky, then found a sheltered place to rest. As Ruth slept, I looked at the map. It was a curse. As long as I had it, men like Edward would hunt me. I couldn't go to the law. Who would believe me? A penniless woman with a dead outlaw's child. They'd take the map and throw me in jail. There was only one person who could end this. The man who started it all. Silas. Edward thought he was dead. The gang thought he'd run. But I knew him. Silas wasn't the type to just disappear. He was arrogant. He would want to see the fruits of his betrayal. He'd be waiting somewhere, close by, for the dust to settle, ready to swoop in and claim his prize. I had to find him first. I had to use the one thing he wanted, the map, to lure him into a trap of my own making. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. My justice. I looked down at my daughter, her face so peaceful in sleep. I would not let her grow up in a world where men like Silas and Edward held all the power. I would not let her be a pawn in their greedy games. I tore a small corner off the real map, a piece showing the final approach to the hidden passage. I tucked it safely away. Then I took the rest of the map, the key to a fortune, and I set it on fire. I watched the vellum curl and blacken, the ink disappearing into ash. The gold was gone. Let Edward search for it in 100 caves. Let him waste his life chasing a ghost. I didn't need the whole map. I just needed enough to set my trap. A new plan was forming in my mind, a desperate, dangerous plan. I knew a place Silas had once talked about, a small, abandoned mining town called Last Chance. A place where a man could disappear. A place where a final, bloody reunion could be staged. I was no longer running from the monsters. I was going to hunt one of them down. The ride to Last Chance was a descent into a different kind of hell. It wasn't the sun-baked emptiness of the open desert, but a jagged, broken land of badlands and abandoned claims. The ghosts of failed dreams seemed to hang in the air. I pushed the horse and myself to the limit, fueled by a mixture of cold rage and sleepless adrenaline. Ruth was quiet, her small face reflecting the grim determination she saw in mine. She didn't ask questions. She just held on tight. Last Chance wasn't a town anymore. It was a skeleton. A handful of buildings, their windows like vacant eyes, leaned against each other as if for support. A dusty main street was punctuated by the lonely creak of a swinging saloon sign. It was the perfect place for a final act. It reeked of endings. I knew Silas would be here. It was exactly his kind of poetry, to wait for his fortune in a place called Last Chance. I found the old assayer's office at the end of the street. It was solid, built of stone, with thick walls and a heavy iron-banded door. It had only one window facing the street. It was defensible. It was a perfect trap. I spent the day preparing. I found a loose board in the floor and hid Ruth underneath with a blanket in our remaining water. I told her it was a new hiding game, the most important one we'd ever played. I made her promise not to make a sound, no matter what she heard. Her big, trusting eyes nearly broke my heart, but I hardened it. This was the only way. Then I took the corner of the map, the only piece I'd saved, and pinned it to the outside of the assayer's door. It was a clear invitation, a challenge. I barricaded the door from the inside with a heavy desk, leaving just enough space to see out. I took my position by the window, pistol in hand, and I waited. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows down the empty street. The silence of the ghost town pressed in on me. Every creak of old wood, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. Was this a mistake? Had my anger made me reckless? And then I saw him. He appeared at the far end of the street, walking out of the dying light like an apparition. It was Silas. He looked different, thinner, his clothes ragged, but it was him. The easy, confident swagger was still there. He saw the piece of map on the door. He stopped. He knew it was a trap. Of course he did. But his arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than anyone else, wouldn't let him walk away. He slowly, cautiously started walking down the street, his hand on the pistol at his hip. My own hand was slick with sweat as I gripped my gun. My heart was a drum beating out a rhythm of fear and hate. This was the man I had once loved, the father of my child, and I was about to kill him. He reached the door. He didn't try to open it. He just stood there, staring at the map fragment. "Nora," he called out, his voice smooth as whiskey, the same voice that had whispered 1,000 lies in my ear. "I know you're in there. Clever girl." "I always knew you were clever." I didn't answer. "Come on out, darling," he cooed. "It's all over now. The gang is gone. That fool Edward is probably lost in the canyons. It's just us, the way it was always meant to be. We can have it all." The hypocrisy of it, the sheer audacity was breathtaking. I raised my pistol, aiming for the center of the window. My hand was shaking. I thought of Ruth, hidden beneath the floorboards. I thought of the 2 days we spent dying in the desert. I thought of the siege, the gunfire, the terror. My hand steadied. "It's over for you, Silas," I called out, my voice hard, unrecognizable. I saw him tense. His hand tightened on his gun. "Don't be like that, Nora. You don't have it in you." He was wrong. The woman he knew, the soft, trusting girl, had died in the desert. A different woman had taken her place. A survivor, a mother, a killer. But before I could pull the trigger, another voice echoed down the empty street, a voice I never expected to hear again. "She's right, Silas. It's over." I whipped my head around to look out the other side of the window. Walking slowly, deliberately down the street from the opposite direction was Edward. He was no longer limping. His arm was in a sling, but in his good hand he held a rifle, and it was aimed directly at Silas's back. My trap had caught 2 monsters instead of 1. Silas spun around, his face a mask of shocked fury. "Edward, you're supposed to be dead." "Your gang was clumsy," Edward said, his voice cold and flat, "and your maps were cheap. But I'm a patient man. I followed the tracks. Your tracks." The 2 men stood frozen in a deadly standoff in the middle of the ghost town. I was in the assayer's office, my pistol still raised. We were a triangle of death, a moment of perfect, lethal balance. Silas started to laugh, a wild, unhinged sound. "So this is it? My partner and my woman, teaming up against me? It's beautiful." He looked from Edward to the office window where I was hiding. "So who gets to do it? Who gets the honor?" Edward's face was grim. "This isn't about honor. It's about a stolen payroll and a dead marshal." Silas's eyes glinted. "And the gold, Edward. Don't forget the gold. She has the map. Kill her and we can split it, just like we planned." Edward's gaze flickered toward my window. I could see the conflict in his eyes. The gold. The reason he'd done all of this. Was his greed stronger than his desire for revenge? For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to turn his gun on me. But then he looked back at Silas and his face hardened. "The gold was never the point, Silas. Not for me. This was always about my partner. You just made it complicated." That was it. That was my chance. While they were focused on each other, their old partnership and betrayals bubbling to the surface, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let either of them walk away from this. I wasn't going to let my daughter's future be decided by which monster won. I took a deep breath, aimed my pistol not at Silas, but at the old rusty lantern hanging from a post right above his head. I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the metal lantern with a loud clang. It wasn't the shot that mattered. It was the sound, the sharp, sudden noise that broke the standoff. Both men flinched, and in that instant of distraction, I fired again. This time, my aim was true. The bullet hit Silas in the shoulder. He cried out, staggering back, his own gun firing wildly into the dirt. Edward didn't hesitate. He took his shot, a single clean rifle report that echoed through the empty street. Silas dropped to his knees, then fell face first into the dust. He didn't move again. Silence descended, a heavy, final silence. It was over. I slowly lowered my pistol, my body trembling with the aftermath of it all. Edward walked over to Silas's body, nudging him with his boot to make sure he was dead. Then he looked up at me, at the window of the assayer's office. Our eyes met across the dusty street. We were the only two left, the liar and the survivor. He raised his rifle, and for a long, terrible moment, he pointed it directly at me. My heart stopped. This was it. He would tie up the last loose end. He would take the map and disappear. But I wasn't going to beg. I just stared back, my face a mask of defiance. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he lowered the rifle. He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the twilight without a single word. He was leaving me the choice, the life. I waited until his footsteps faded completely before I finally moved. I pulled the heavy desk away from the door and stumbled outside. The air smelled of dust and cordite. I walked over to Silas's body. I reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was empty, of course. Then I looked at the locket, still around his neck. The original, the one he'd kept for himself. I tore it from its chain. I didn't open it. I threw it as far as I could into the sagebrush. I went back to the office and lifted the floorboard. Ruth looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Is the game over, Mama?" she asked. I knelt and pulled her into my arms, burying my face in her hair, the tears finally coming. Sobs that tore their way up from a place deep inside me that I thought had turned to stone. "Yes, baby," I whispered. "The game is over. We won." We left Last Chance the next morning. I took Silas's horse and whatever supplies he had. I never saw Edward again. I don't know if he ever found his gold, and I don't care. Sometimes I wonder if he was a marshal after all, one who went so far off the path of the law he couldn't find his way back. Or maybe he was just a thief with a good story. It doesn't matter. We rode east, back toward the world that had cast us out. But we weren't the same people. We weren't strays anymore. We were survivors. I had enough money from Silas's saddlebags to buy a small plot of land. A place no one wanted. A place where we could be left alone. It was hard work, but my hands were harder now, and my heart, which I thought had been broken and burned to ash, was slowly, stubbornly beginning to heal. The desert tried to kill us, men tried to use us, but they all underestimated the strength of a mother with nothing left to lose. They didn't know that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has decided she will not be a victim anymore. If you were captivated by Nora's journey from the edge of death to the master of her own fate, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming your way. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think happened to Edward? Did he find the gold, or did the desert claim him in the end?